We might be opening our Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 11. We're going to start our study there. I think I saw a smile when I announced that. It might be that kind of lesson, but I hope you'll hang with me here. Daniel, chapter 11. We're certainly glad to see those who are visiting and guests of the congregation here. You may not realize it, but this year we've been going through the Bible story, and what we've been doing in some of our times here up in the pulpit, we've been talking about that story and telling the story and then drawing some applications from it. Well, this morning we talked about the story of Daniel and some of the events that happened in his life and the things associated with Daniel. And so I thought then it would be a good time to do a lesson that would approach and address a need that came across my radar some time ago, that it might be helpful to address the topic we're going to look at tonight. So that's why we're doing this lesson, and that's why we're doing it this evening after our story of Daniel. I'll go ahead and talk to you about the title and some of the general things we're going to try and do in this lesson. So I'm calling this lesson The Authenticity of Daniel 10 through 11. I mentioned to someone earlier today, I said, this lesson is going to be a little bit more dense. And he replied, well, that's good. We have a preacher who's a little dense. And I'm amazed at the kind of encouragement and the uplifting comments that you always seem to find and to come bring out of nowhere. By the way, it was not James Huff who mentioned that, although you might be wondering that. It wasn't him this time. Like I said, it came to my attention that maybe this would be the kind of lesson that for not maybe just individuals, but for many of us, might be a kind of a helpful lesson to do. But with that said, what I want to do is, this is not a class. All right, this is not going to be an effort to teach or to instruct. This is actually an attempt to persuade and to give all of us some just very simple, down-to-earth thoughts that we can bring to the question of, did Daniel, the historical biblical Daniel, really write not just the entire book, but specifically chapters 10 and 11? I want to go ahead and look in chapter 11 just to take a sample out of this section to look at why we're zeroing in on these two chapters. Chapters 10 through 12 of Daniel are a vision that he receives about what will be some of the fortunes and the fates of the Jewish people from that time leading up to the time of the Messiah. And the one thing about especially chapter 11 is that there's constant mention of a king to the north and kings to the south and the fights and the wars that they have among each other. And historians recognize that this is talking about the kings to the north, the Seleucids, some of the heirs of Alexander the Great's empire, and the Ptolemies who are based in Egypt. It's about their kind of tug of war over the land of Israel. Just as an example of what these chapters are talking about, look down to verse 25. Talking about the king of the north, whom history knows as Antiochus IV, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. By the way, we know that the king of the south in this context was young Ptolemy VI, a teenager who was ruling in Egypt. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. This talks about the time in 169 when Antiochus IV came down to the south and tried to fight against Ptolemy VI in Egypt. And Ptolemy VI was actually betrayed by some of his advisors, those who, in a sense, are supported by him, who eat of his delicacies. But go on down then to verse 28. Of the king of the north, while returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. On the way back from that battle, Antiochus IV stopped in Jerusalem. He sacked part of the land and committed some other outrages there. Go on to verse 29. At the appointed time, he shall return and go toward the south, but shall not be like the former or the latter. History knows this as the year 168, when Antiochus IV marched against Egypt the next year. But it says in verse 30, ships from Cyprus, or that is Kittim, shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So history knows that in the year 168, when Antiochus IV moved against Egypt, before he got down into Egyptian territory to fight, there was an ambassador and you might say just this delegation from Rome. The Jewish people thought anything to the west of the Mediterranean, oh, that's Kittim. All right, that's that region over there. We know that as Rome. And we know that this Roman delegation, led by a very, very old, aged senator by the name of Gaius Popilius Linus, met Antiochus IV, and he had basically a booklet of a decree from the Roman Senate. We are in alliance with Ptolemy here in Egypt. You will not march against him in his land. What answer do you give to the Roman Senate? And Antiochus IV says, well, I'll get together with my men and we'll take counsel and we'll give you an answer. Without saying a word, the Roman senator took his cane and he put it in the dirt and he drew a line and walked in a circle around Antiochus IV. And when he finished the circle, he said, you will not move out of that circle until you give me an answer to return to the Roman Senate. I guess we're at peace now with Rome. Thank you. And Antiochus IV goes back in a rage, and on the way back, he hits Jerusalem hard. And it's at this time as well that he allows some of those pro-Greek elements in the city of Jerusalem to wreak havoc in the temple compound and to set up images to the Greek gods and to do a lot of things to forbid sacrifices. Go on to verse 31. Forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who did wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. That's a reference to in 167, when Antiochus IV was wreaking the spiritual havoc in Jerusalem. There was a priest by the name of Mattathias who, with his boys, stirred up a reaction and rebellion, opposition to all of these evil things. One of those brothers was called, by nickname, Maccabeus, which means the hammer. And so this is the start of the Maccabean revolt in 167. What am I really driving at here? This is not a history lesson. What I'm trying to say is that everyone, believer and unbeliever alike, looks at Daniel 10 and 11, and it is astounding at what great detail where you can take well-established, uncontroversial historical facts and map it onto Daniel 10 and 11, and it matches perfectly. And so here is then the issue. The big questions are, why do some people then reject Daniel's authorship of chapters 10 and 11? I think we clearly see that if these chapters are authentic, if they were indeed written by a man in Babylon in the 500s BC, and yet he foretells with such minute detail, not just historical actions, but historical motivations and psychology that were recorded, there must be a divine hand behind that. But some do question whether Daniel actually wrote chapters 10 and 11. And the other big question is, on the other side, is it reasonable to believe Daniel actually wrote these chapters? You know, I know some years ago you've had some lessons here in the church, well before my time. Is it reasonable to believe that God exists? Is it reasonable to believe that God created the heavens and the earth, that a design means that there is a designer? Is it reasonable to reject the kind of evolution that's taught in academic circles today? This is the kind of lesson I'm trying to present. Is it reasonable to have faith in God and yet to be a rational person believing that Daniel actually wrote these things? On one level, we could get as down into the weeds as we want to about it, but that's not what our gathering is about here this evening, and that's maybe not as helpful. I want to talk about just common sense things that you and I and just anyone could think about without having to be an expert in anything. Just some common sense things that will help us approach this question. So, first of all, what are some of the arguments that not just these two chapters, but what are some of the usual suspects of arguments that you'll hear for why the book of Daniel was not written when it claims to be in the 500s or so, but that it was written in the 160s, far after the real Daniel would have lived? Because that way we get to take God out of the equation. That's the idea. Well, some say that the book of Daniel, written in the 160s, But the biblical Daniel lived in the 500s. That's the claim that we're now going to evaluate. The first one that we know of, who championed this view was a man by the name of Porphyry around the year 275. I first encountered Porphyry not having anything to do with Daniel, but I was looking at him for a different reason. But this same ancient philosopher wrote a book called Against the Christians. He was kind of like the Richard Dawkins of the ancient world. And anybody who was any sort of a recognized, educated Christian wrote his bit trying to refute Porphyry. Just like any budding musician wants to do a cover of some Beatles songs, every Christian author, it seems, wanted to do his refutation of Porphyry. And a lot of this was actually written by this Porphyry so long ago. He said, well, there are historical inaccuracies in Daniel. There in chapter 5 is King Belshazzar, but history does not know of any King Belshazzar. So that's a made-up name. And Darius the Mede, who ruled in Babylon after the Persians took over, everyone knows that Cyrus was the first king of Persia, not some Darius. And so there's the argument that it has historical inaccuracies throughout the book. But that's not a very good and solid argument, because actually historians have recognized that Belshazzar was actually a king in Babylon. His father Nabonidus actually was the true king. But now historians have uncovered that and refuted that. Some other arguments is that the language and style shows that it was written very late, that it couldn't have been written by biblical Daniel because of all the Persian and Aramaic or Aramean loan words. But again, that's not a very good and solid argument as well, because, well, it doesn't take a problem with migration in our country to recognize that, yes, a lot of Spanish loanwords have come into English today. But if you also look back about 150 years or so in the American West, while the frontier was expanding, there at that time was a lot of interaction with different languages. So just because Persian or Aramaic may show up in the book, it doesn't mean that it had to have been written late. Some say that the theology of Daniel is wrong for its time. In Daniel chapter 12, he is told, "You will rest and arise to your inheritance at the end of the days." And the skeptic will say, well, early on in Jewish history, in the time of the biblical Daniel, they didn't have a resurrection yet. And so that's obviously a sign that later theological developments came along. But again, that's not a very good argument as well, because I could go through the Old Testament, as Lord willing we will do in a future sermon, and talk about the resurrection and the afterlife, as it's already revealed somewhat in the Old Testament. Some also say, well, in the intertestamental period, there was a book called Sirach. And this guy goes through a who's who of all the great Hebrew and Jewish heroes of faith. He never mentions Daniel. Therefore, the Daniel of this book had to have come way, way after him in the 100s. But that also is a bad argument, because the Sirach also doesn't mention Ezra and other greats from the Old Testament. Maybe he forgot, or maybe that wasn't his purpose. The point we're trying to make is that Daniel was not ignored. In the Old Testament itself, he's mentioned as a living legend in Ezekiel chapter 14, and again in chapter 28 of Ezekiel, a man living at the same time as him. We could go further on this, and I've got other notes on that, but we want to go ahead on to what I believe is actually the main argument that is put forward for why not just the book of Daniel, but specifically chapters 10 and 11 must be late. And that is, the author displays such detailed knowledge of events from the years 300 to about 160. The argument goes, no one can write about historical events until after they happen. Seems kind of common sense, doesn't it? You can't write about something that's historical until the history happened. So if a book mentions historical events, it must have been written after those events occurred. Ain't rocket science. Other ancient works, by the way, also pretended to be prophetic. And so someone says, well, Daniel says he's being prophetic. The skeptic comes along and says, well, there are a lot of other things in the ancient world that claim to be prophetic, but very clearly were not. They were pretending to be prophetic. Anybody can sit down and write about recent events, but pretend like it's someone from 1,000 years before writing about it, but the forgerer is found out. And so the book of Daniel, they say, is just like these other kinds of works. Therefore, the argument then claims, Daniel was written in the 160s. So, if that is true, the book of Daniel is not prophecy. It's pseudo or fake, counterfeit prophecy. What does that say then about God, about His Word, about the commitment of our faith? But also look on the other side of it. If Daniel actually was written when it claims to be written, no one can deny that there must be something divine behind that, for the very reasons that we just outlined above. So let me, before I get to the heart of the matter, I want to talk about some reasons to accept the book of Daniel's authenticity. How do you know any ancient document is authentic? How do you know Julius Caesar wrote a civil war? How do you know a Homer wrote the Iliad or the Odyssey, if indeed Homer ever existed? How do you know any ancient document is authentic? How do you know that Abraham Lincoln wrote and delivered the Gettysburg Address? You were not there. And as far as I know, we have no recordings of that last example. We've got a photograph, but we don't have any we can't go back in a time machine and see. So how do you know any ancient document is authentic? Well, a text will claim to be by an author. The author will give his name, or in some cases, there is the evidence of contemporaries, those who lived at the same time who say, oh yeah, here was this work, this text, this book, and it claims to be by this guy, and we all know it was written by this guy. But also there's something called a manuscript tradition that when scribes are conveying this and passing it down through the ages, they retain, because it's kind of important, who wrote it, and they will often include that in the titles as they copy it down from age to age. There are ancient and medieval encyclopedias and handbooks that compile knowledge, and they list authors, and so later ancient and medieval and early modern scholarship, if all of these things come together and they say, so-and-so wrote the book, we usually take it that so-and-so wrote that book. Okay? Unless there is some kind of other form of evidence that contradicts that. There is no question of the authorship for any number of classical works. Many of them survive only through a very scant manuscript tradition. Some ancient authors and their works only survive because a monk or some janitor in the 14 or 1500s uncovered this text of an author that we thought was lost, and it survives just by the thread of that one piece of paper. Or maybe just by one or two references by other authors. And yet we go to the bank and we can count on this guy wrote that work. I can affirm there is no textual, there is no historical reason to declare that Daniel 10 and 11 is inauthentic. And what I'm trying to say then is that ultimately, by whatever standard we judge the authorship, Daniel and Daniel 10:11 passes the test. There is no question. And if we are going to go about removing from consideration any objection to any authorship, the historical enterprise cannot go on. And yet that's just what the skeptic asks us to do about the book of Daniel. The enterprise of history depends upon documentary evidence. What I'm trying to say is the same criteria by which you would judge the authenticity of other works, Daniel meets that criteria. There's no reason to declare that inauthentic, but you see, unless. And here's actually the crux of the matter. Here is the real reason that some reject Daniel 10 through 11. It's not for any of the reasons I've just mentioned above. This gets to the heart of it. The true objection is not textual. There's no reason to look at this text and to conclude internally that Daniel could not have written it. And there's no reason historically why a Daniel in Babylon in the 500s BC could not have written this book. The only objection is tied to a deeper belief. There is no extra-natural being called God. Therefore, divinely inspired prophecy is impossible. That is the only and single reason to ever reject what Daniel 10 through 11 is saying. Therefore, the case for rejecting the authenticity of Daniel 10 through 11 rests upon a logical fallacy called begging the question, or as we might call it, circular reasoning. Nowadays, begging the question, people mean they raise the question. Actually, that's a logical fallacy. It means that you assume the point you're arguing about in an argument you're making. Sadly, Christians, many of us do that all the time. Do you believe that there is a God? The Christian says, of course there is a God. How do you know? Well, the Bible is His Word. Wait a minute, the Bible is His Word? That's not good reasoning. That's exactly the thing we're trying to debate. That's called circular reasoning. When you assume the end of the argument so that you can make your arguments for that. When someone says, well, Daniel could not have written Daniel 10 through 11 because there's no extranatural being called God, and so he couldn't have been inspired to do it, that's called a logical fallacy. You're begging the question. We're trying to decide about whether God exists or not. And so you can't come in and say, now before we get to the question, I'm going to tie your hands of the discussion and already assume that we've decided it. All right, now time in, let's argue about it. That's not what logical and rational and honest people who are honest intellectually, that's not how you go about it. And because of that, there is no amount and there is no kind of evidence that would ever change a skeptic's mind. What would that evidence look like? An archaeological find? What if we found a tablet out in the desert of ancient Mesopotamia and it says, this is Daniel, and I actually wrote Daniel 10 and 11. You know what the scholarly community would say to that? It's a forgery. Someone faked that. There is no archaeological evidence that will ever be found, that could be found, that would prove that. There's not going to be some new text, some record from the desert or a monastery. All of these would be dismissed as forgeries or frauds on the same basis that Daniel has already rejected. What I'm trying to say is, someone says, well, prove to me that it's true and authentic. Nothing will ever prove that to you because you've already decided there is no God. The discussion's over then at that point. And you can try and get me to be tied all into knots trying to prove this and that. You will always have an answer for it, for something that will satisfy you. And no amount of evidence will ever change it. This is true. No amount of evidence ever changes someone's mind if they reject the hypothesis before it's even tested and scrutinized. For someone to say, convince me that Daniel 10 through 11 is authentic, but you can only work from the assumption that rejects God out of hand. To say that is to try to start a conversation where you've already decided its conclusion set in stone. It's not fair. It's not intellectually honest. That's not an objective scientific search for truth. That approach ultimately is forcing you and another person to talk past one another endlessly. But on the other hand, accepting the authorship and the early date of Daniel, it does not require circular reasoning. Accepting it is just accepting a sound historical method that is receptive to following the evidence wherever it leads, without handicapping that evidence beforehand. If someone comes to me and says, you prove to me that Daniel 10 and 11 is authentic, but by the way, we all know that there is no God. Now go about doing that. That's called handicapping, or trying to, in a sense, tamper the evidence before the evidence is looked at objectively and fairly. But on the other hand, if I say, I am going to come at this objectively, I am not going to prejudice whether there is a God or not a God, or Daniel 10 through 11 is this or that. I'm just going to look at the evidence historically and textually and go where that evidence takes me. For that question, you come to the conclusion, based upon sound historical method, that Daniel 10 through 11 is authentic. But someone might make the reply, well, Daniel 10 through 11 is not just any ancient work. The kinds of claims, the kinds of things in there, it requires a greater burden of proof. He makes claims that bear a greater burden of proof. And I can simply say, no, the content may bear a greater burden of proof, not the identity of the author. And I hope you can see the great important difference there. Yes, Daniel 10 through 11, and any claim that there is a God and that Jesus rose from the dead and all the things we see in Scripture, yes, that does bear a greater burden of proof, but the fact of who wrote them, that is not something that bears a greater burden of proof than any other ancient work. So let's summarize this and end with what I hope and what I trust is an important point for all of us to take home and to build our faith. That's what I'm trying to do here. We're not trying to win arguments. We're not trying to win anything. We're trying to build faith. We're trying to instill faith and solidify it. In summary, no evidence presented demands a late date of authorship for Daniel unless you already reject the possibility of a divine being. But I want to share something with you that I hope will be meaningful to you, anyone who listens to this. Daniel 10 through 11 is not about proving whether there is a God or not. That's not the point of Daniel 10 and 11. In fact, I know of precious few scriptures where there's even the hint that God inspired someone to go prove to the unbeliever that God really is. There are some, but precious few. You would think that there would be an entire book or an entire large section of Scripture trying to persuade all the skeptics out there. That's not how God said about His work. And there are all sorts of different reasons, I think, for that, some of which clearly we would not know. But that's not the point of Daniel 10 through 11. So please, don't ask the text to do something it was not intended to do. What is Daniel 10 through 11 for? It was to provide assurance for the Jews and to build their faith. There's a very specific audience that God had in mind, and that was His people who were living under captivity and living under the dispersion of the Jews throughout the known world, and Jews who were living under the oppressive thumb of the Greeks and then later the Romans. They needed their faith built. They needed assurance. And Daniel 10 through 11 is God's way of saying, no matter what this world throws at you, no matter what happens to you, I've already called it beforehand, and so that should prove to you, I am in charge, I am the Almighty, I rule in heaven. Let all the earth keep silence before me. You can trust me, and I will deliver and be faithful to my covenant. That's what Daniel 10 through 11 is about. The real question is, what are you going to do about the resurrection of Jesus? And that might seem like a jarring segue, like a jarring transition, but it's absolutely not. Because it seems to me that in Jesus' life, as we read in Matthew 24, He quoted Daniel, noted how Daniel the prophet made reference to an abomination of desolation, quoting from the very scripture we began with. And so Jesus ties himself inseparably to Daniel's prophecy. If Daniel is a fraud, Jesus is a fraud. If what Jesus said and what happened to Jesus and what He did and how He rose again, if that is true, and the historical documentation is taken seriously, what that means is that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the resurrected Lord. He has all authority. You and I are accountable to Him. And Daniel was dead right about all that he said. No, it's not about Daniel 10 and 11. That's the wrong starting place. Don't start there. Start with the resurrection. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. When someone comes to me and they say, well, my faith, whether I keep believing in God, well, it's dependent upon what happens with Daniel 10 and 11. I'm sorry, that's not the right way to go about it. That's not fair. That's not intellectually honest and consistent. Someone says, well, I will remain an atheist or agnostic to the day I die unless you could prove to me something about Daniel 10 and 11. Good, we want to have a conversation, but that's not where it starts. That's the wrong place to start. Because if you want to start there, you and I will never meet. We'll never get anywhere. I never will with you, and you never will with me if we want to start there. God didn't intend for us to start there. But on the other hand, I'll show you somewhere that's profitable to start. We have no one contests that 1 Corinthians 15 is authentically by Paul. No one that I know of who has a brain cell argues with that. And yet look at 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast that word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that He was buried, and that He rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that He was seen by Cephas and then by the 12. After that He was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that He was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all He was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. For I am the least of the apostles, who am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and by His grace toward me, and His grace toward me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. Therefore, whether it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. Do you believe that we can know anything about the past based upon ancient books and letters? We know that there was a man named Paul who was called Saul of Tarsus, who persecuted Christians, and he wrote a letter to the church in Corinth, and we have it preserved faithfully today. Facts. This man who used to persecute Christians had something that changed him. And he wrote to these Christians and he says, you know the eyewitness testimony that I brought forth, that Cephas or Peter brought forth, that others brought forth. By the way, Corinthians, 500 saw Jesus appear to them after the resurrection. Some of them are dead, but most of them are still alive. You know what Paul is actually doing? Read between the lines. What Paul is actually issuing is a challenge. You don't believe me? Get in a boat, sail to Judea, and ask around and find out whether that's so or not. I want to tell you, a skeptic, all he had to do was to get in a boat, go to Judea, and find out that upon simple asking and investigation, the greater part of the 500 aren't around. That debunks, that ruins the whole thing. Paul was putting it all on claims like that, and yet he unashamedly, confidently, without any kind of hesitation, issues the most outstanding claims. The only rational explanation is he saw something, and those greater part of the 500 did as well, and Paul says, you call my bluff, go check it out. They're there, and they will testify the same thing that I saw. Why are we selective about historical documentation that we will accept and that we will reject only if I've already decided the question before I get into the investigation? That's not fair intellectually. It's not fair to yourself. It's not fair to your soul to do such a thing as that. Come objectively, looking at the merits of this text for what they are. These men lived and they died believing what they saw, and they wrote it down. And whatever you think about the rest of the Bible, it's not just about Genesis and the creation account. It's not just about the flood. It's not just about the prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament, which are many and which are fulfilled in Him. It's not just about Daniel. It ultimately comes down to, do you believe your eyes and what you see in front of you of what these men claim to have seen, to have experienced? As John put in 1 John 1 and following, which our eyes have seen and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. I believe Daniel 10 and 11. Number one, because I have no reason, textually or historically, to disbelieve it. But ultimately, I believe it was prophetic, the work of a divine hand, because Jesus accepted it. And I accept the testimony about Jesus Christ. And like so many, it's time to give my life to it. Thank you for listening this afternoon. And I know that there are so many things and so many different angles and directions we could take this. But if you've got questions and want to study further, I'm happy to do it. And even if you disagree with this, whether you're here or you happen to be listening, I get a little hot and passionate about it, but please don't take that as being unapproachable. I hope not. I do get excited. I do get passionate about this because I think it's a matter of life and death and beyond. And so I hope that we could talk together, that we could study together if you've got questions or disagreements about it. But for now, at this point in the service, I want to encourage you and I want you to know that if you have been thinking about becoming a Christian and you know that you must make that step, the opportunity is before you. But it's not just here at the end of the service. Any hour, day and night. You've got so many people here, close to the building, who will come here and open it up if you want to be baptized into Christ and become His child. But now is an opportunity. Now you're alive. Now you're among friends and those who have also made that step. We'd love to see you do that tonight. And if, dear Christian, there's any way that we could pray for you, we can encourage you not just tonight, but in the days and weeks ahead and more. And we hope you'd let that be known as well. If in any way we can help you, please come while we stand and sing the song of encouragement.